Morning, everyone. Now, let me give you some background. Gladwell did give some background, but she did not describe the agonizing process at which we arrived at this report. Now, when I went to speak to Gladwell about doing some work on corruption, her initial proposal was we needed to do a summary of anti-corruption reforms and ask whether and how they are working. And then we might throw in a bit of political economy, which is considered good optics for donors. They like that kind of thing. And then I went and sat down, and I struggled for almost 2 months, and I couldn't get a word on paper. And I couldn't get a word on paper because I was struck by 6 persisting problems of anti-corruption fight in Kenya. And those are, if you look at the number of laws and policies and initiatives against corruption in Kenya, you might be led to conclude that Kenya is outranked only by Switzerland in terms of the integrity of its public space, because we've got lots and lots of this. If you look at the money lost in reported scandals, only reported scandals, if you look at the size, the nature, the character of the contracts involved, you would conclude that somebody very high up in government is involved. But if you look at who is arrested and convicted, you must conclude that Kenya has some of the most dangerous, greedy, and brilliant low-level bureaucrats in the world, because they are the ones who carry the weight of these big scandals that you'd assume were perpetrated by people who are very senior in government. If you look at how we arrest and prosecute the corrupt, you might think that Kenya hires ecologists for working in law enforcement. Some of you who are familiar with ecology know that when you want to estimate a population in an ecology, you get there are those rings you throw in. It's called, then you catch the animals, you mark them, then you release them. Capture, mark, release. If you look at how we arrest people and prosecute them for corruption, it's got that pattern. You capture, you mark, and release. Only to capture and mark and release another day in the future. If you look at the public reaction, you must conclude that corruption doesn't pain anyone, because the public doesn't show outrage. And finally, if you look at how we implement anti-corruption reform, and if you look at it, the way you describe it is that we have these frantic, almost manic periods of reform, followed by long stretches of what you might consider cryogenic freezing. You know how you cryogenically freeze a body? If you are a person with a bit of money and there is no medicine to treat you, you can be frozen for a number of years. And then when the medicine is finally discovered, you are resuscitated and given the medicine. given the medicine. So we have got these periods of frantic reform followed by long periods of cryogenic freezing. So that these 6 paradoxes, these 6 problems of anti-corruption reform led me to ask, what are we doing wrong? Obviously, the solution wasn't to propose more legal reform because we have enough. The solution wasn't to suggest prosecution of big fish because they would arrest the junior guys. The thing wasn't that to look at more reforms. That wasn't going to work. And this is how we then alighted on this idea. The perspective we needed to adopt was a perspective that would explain why all these things happen and corruption doesn't seem to ever go away. We've had I've been, at least myself, I've been in this fight since 1990, 1991. So I've come to the conclusion, maybe it's not going to happen in my lifetime, that I'll see corruption reduced in Kenya. So the state capture problem, first a very general definition, then I will get into more details a little later. Think about state capture as the repurposing of state institutions to private profiteering. And I'll describe this in a little more detail soon. If the state has been repurposed to private profiteering, the implications are that public policy and legislative reform aren't going to work. That's the immediate implication. And in the context of what is going on now, why would anybody bother to propose more policy reform and legislative reform if we have already hypothesized that the state has been repurposed? So that whatever reform is going to be implementing are not going to be reforms directed at fighting corruption. This is the starting point. The report itself, just to summarize, has 4 parts. The first part is theoretical and analytical, but extremely important because it explains why the perspective on state capture is adopted as opposed to any other perspective. It also explains why conventional reform-based approaches will not work. And then it will explain why state capture is the appropriate way to see this situation. The second part looks at tales of capture, and it gives 3 tales of capture: Goldenberg, Anglo-leasing, and Eurobond. I focus on these 3 because you can draw certain standard lessons from each of them. And they've got a certain profile, which I'll be mentioning in a few minutes. Then the third part looks at the mechanics of capture. How is capture organized in practice? And then finally, the last part talks about undoing capture. The general tone of the report is not very optimistic, as you will see as I speak. Not because I don't think anything can be done, but I think the realistic options available are actually very limited. But we'll talk about that either now or in Q&A. Let us begin by setting the scene. If you look back for the last 15 months, we've had very frantic, we are in one of those phases of having come out of our cryogenic freeze. There have been very frantic reforms, of very frantic action over the last 15 months. We have a new AG, we have a new DPP, which means that we have had a makeover of the State Law Office. The State Law Office under the previous Attorney General operated like the legal wing of State House. The theory was that by making over the State Law Office, you could give impetus to anti-corruption reform. But the makeover of the State Law Office also came together with a handshake. And the handshake had a very important dimension to anti-corruption in Kenya because it restored the political legitimacy that the president was facing, having had an election nullified and having won an election that had a very low voter turnout, basically illegitimate. So that people then argued that now the president did have political gremlins to worry about, and he had a new state law office, he should be able to fight corruption. And he would be able to fight corruption because, 1, he was concerned about his legacy, and 2, the economy could no longer be his legacy because the economy, all the measures he had taken to try and deal with the economy had not really worked. And the initial measures were impressive. I remember being accosted by people who told me, you critics, because there are people out there who just dab everybody in this paint puzzle, in this brush. You critics. Now you see, the president has initiated a new wave of prosecutions, and he's even arrested some big fish. He has initiated a get our money back. We've written to 7 countries, Australia. I mean, the countries were named. We have even impressed donors. I think UNECA called President Kenyatta an African champion. The State Law Office was reinvigorated. The multi-agency task force on corruption was reinvigorated. And 1,000 procurement officers were sent home to be revetted and reappraised, including through lie detector tests. I would have been very keen to design the questions for the lie detection tests. Now, yet, with all this activity, there is a certain freeze again. And people have this sense that corruption isn't being fought. So, what is going on? The first thing to note is that the current approach has been largely tactical. It's too legalistic, it's too prosecution-driven, it's too activity-driven. So we are a series of unconnected activities in which corruption is being fought. And then it's been instrumentalized. It's been instrumentalized so that it's become not a weapon for fighting Kenya's governance crisis, but a weapon for resolving Jubilee's internal problems, internal political problems. And it has become, it's a certain serendipity, there's a certain serendipity in this, because one faction thought, having control of the state power, it would be able to use it to get rid of their enemies. But in fact, the other faction has also learned that if you expose what you know about what is going on, you have a mutually assured destruction, which is exactly what is going on. Now, all the measures now being implemented are a carbon copy of the measures that Kibaki implemented in 2003, 2004. Those measures failed then, and they are going to fail now for those which are not already failed. I remember thinking to myself, why 1,000 procurement officers? Kibaki sent home 1,000 procurement officers. Uhuru sent home 1,000 procurement officers. What is magical about 1,000? Then I thought to myself, maybe these guys, the advisors, maybe they've been reading, you know, those books, Haditha Fulela Ulela, 1,001 Nights. maybe they've been reading these. Let's just cut this to 1,000. It's a nice round number. Because there is no explanation why they should be sending 1,000, not more than 1,000. Why do these reform efforts keep failing? They fail because they do not address the real problem. The real problem is the union of corruption and politics. What you have is a cabal of insiders who capture the state, and principally, not all of the state, principally the presidency, treasury, and the security. Because that's all you need to capture a state. Capture power, capture money, and capture intelligence. If you capture those three permanently, you've basically captured the state. The modern state is actually a very easy thing to capture if you think about it. So that what then happens is the government and the state machinery becomes a temporary zone for personalized appropriation. And politics becomes a competitively aggressive process of trying to get into that zone for appropriation. That's what politics is. Why is the state repurposed this way? The state is repurposed this way, first, so that you can gut government resources, and then you can use some of the gutted resources for electioneering and maintenance of power. And then politics in this context is a zero-sum game, completely zero-sum game. And the state is a victim. And if you think about how we play politics, it is then a competition to see who can be ever faster in the process of enrichment. That's what the state has become. Now, for capture to work, 4 things need to happen. 1, oversight institutions must be eviscerated and hobbled. That is the Office of Controller, the Office of Controller of Budget, the Office of Auditor General, the Commission on Human Rights, parliamentary committees. This must be weakened and eviscerated. Capture is not going to work if any of them is functioning. Law enforcement and rule of law institutions, the police, the judiciary, the prosecution, they must be weakened, captured, or redirected as weapons. As a matter of policy. Ordinary channels of countervailing the power of the state, enforcing accountability, must be weakened too. So civil society, institutions, media, there must be a mechanism by which you can have disclosures, but the disclosures don't enforce accountability. In other words, what captured institutions tend to show is a very high degrees of transparency, but without corresponding degrees of accountability. There is a theory, some democratic theories to twin transparency and accountability, making the assumption that transparency enhances accountability. It is not always the case. And in fact, what we have in a lot of African countries is a clear example where there is enhanced transparency but diminished accountability. And in fact, it is even worse because the transparency increases public expectation. But the lack of accountability frustrates those expectations. So generally, politically, you are in a worse off situation than if you had an opaque system. And then finally, ordinary channels, the fourth mechanism, ordinary channels of accountability through elections are subverted or compromised. And you can see from 2002, maybe we had a reasonably good election, but we've never had an uncontroversial election since then. And this is, and I'll be describing a little later why this is so. Let me then do a bit of highlights of the report. I am going to set the context, say a few things about mechanics of capture. I will not spend too much time going through the individual cases, Goldenberg and Glorlising. The most important thing about those cases is what lessons we draw from them. First of all, let's set the scene globally. This is a global problem. The World Economic Forum, in a report I think last year, estimates that corruption cost the world $2.6 trillion, which is 5% of world GDP. Now, this figure is probably a gross underestimate. It's a gross underestimate because although it is easy to reckon the opportunity cost, for example, of how much education would we have bought if this money was available, there are some opportunity costs that are a little harder to reckon. For instance, let me give you an example, real life example. If you take the road from here to Nakuru, there are 8 roadblocks, police roadblocks. It's 160 kilometers roughly, so there is a roadblock every 20 kilometers. You got to make an assumption that there is a major criminal wave being perpetrated on our roads. I did some back on the envelope calculations. At each of these roadblocks, and the Gilgil one is special, at each of these roadblocks, there are at least 5 police officers. At Gilgil, there are usually 10, 11, 12. So the police station is empty. So right there, there's a problem because you may be able to reckon how much money is lost through corruption, what the money lost through corruption would have done. But what is the security cost of 11 police officers being at a roadblock and not attending to their regular duties? Okay, those are much harder costs to sort of reckon. I did some calculation. If you have 40 officers, which is what you have if you have an average of 5, for 8 hours on the road, it's 320 man-hours wasted per day. It is 9,600 man-hours lost in a month. It is 1,115,200 a year. It is 1.15 million man-hours lost in 10 years. That translates to 391 man-years lost because 40 police officers have stayed on the road to deal with this crime wave that is being perpetrated by Kenyans on the road. Why is Kenya making such a heavy policing traffic? And these are some of the costs then that if you're going to do a proper analysis of corruption, you would have to find what is the cost to the country of this security not being available. Yeah? Okay. So that is the sort of global sort of number in terms of what are we looking at and how does it work. What is Kenya's corruption problem? Kenya's corruption problem, which is a sub-part of part 1, is an old one. It begins at independence. In fact, we had a commission of inquiry in 1965. I don't know how many people know this. 2 years into independence, 1 year into republic. We had a commission of inquiry. It was a commission of inquiry into the maize scandal. There was a maize scandal. And the maize scandal involved Paul Ngei, who was a minister for cooperatives, finagling the state to provide support to his wife, who was running a business. Now, in fact, maize has been so central to corruption. I have been toying with the idea of doing the political biography of maize as a book. Now, that corruption, the corruption that was initiated at independence, it remained of a particular type. It is basically rigging, discretion in government. Procurement wasn't really a big deal until much later, but it was this discretionary power. So it didn't have the characteristics of state capture. In fact, the first corruption scandal we have that has some characteristics of state capture was the Takwel Gorge. The Takwel Gorge scandal involved the construction of the Takwel Gorge Dam. The hydrology was rigged. The eventual amount of money spent on the project was a lot more than would have been spent if we had gone competitive, procured it competitively. And the EU, in a confidential report, did say that the reason why this had worked this way was because key people around President Moi and Nicholas Biwott, his Minister for Energy, had received millions of dollars in kickbacks from the French company that was involved in this. So that was the first scandal that had attributes of state capture in the sense of repurposing the state to private gain. But the real scandal that finally revealed state capture in the form in which I'm going to describe it was the Golden Bag scandal. Because the Golden Bag scandal involved all those dimensions I mentioned: the presidency, treasury, intelligence. They were heavily involved in Golden Bag. People don't often remember that one of the core directors of Goldenberg was the then head of NIS. This is one of those things that is never really mentioned in the reports about Goldenberg, but it's important to keep remembering that. Before we go into these case studies, now I want to spend a few minutes reflecting a little bit more on this state capture approach so that you can see what it is we are talking about. The way we have approached fighting corruption in Kenya, having described a bit of its history, the way we have approached fighting corruption in Kenya is that corruption falls in either grand corruption or petty corruption. The one small, the other big. There's a false assumption behind this categorization, because petty suggests that it is not significant, and grand suggests that it is very destructive of the state. In fact, a lot of places where corruption is a big problem is where petty corruption is generalized throughout the country. So that what you have is a situation where I go to an office, and even before I am asked to give a bribe, I'm already offering somebody to have tea. A friend of mine went to Rwanda, and he was forcing a Rwandan cop to take a bribe because he was telling him, it's okay, you can have some tea. The guy's asking, and the cop kept asking why. Why should I have tea? but it's this expectation. There's a very good book by Babbage called Kenya Shadow in the Shadow. I think it's called The Shadow of Kenyan Democracy. Widespread expectations of widespread corruption. When there are widespread expectations in society about widespread corruption, then you get this sort of thing. If you characterize corruption this way, grand versus petty, you then begin to pathologize corruption. And if you look at the language we use when we're talking about corruption, we talk about it as a disease. Some of the words, if I can remember them, a cancer on the body politic, a disease, a pervasive ill. In other words, corruption is not something that a little bit of chemo, a little bit of antibiotics here, a little bit of lemon and garlic. It's the kind of problem that you can actually deal with. Yeah, because it's a pathology, it's a disease. The state, as a legitimate state, is trying to be a good state, but it's being destroyed by this disease. So your intervention is to provide either medicine to cure the disease or prophylactic to stop infection. That perspective, that the state is sick and can be fixed with appropriate cures, that perspective rests on the assumption that the state is trying to govern, but has been led astray. This report rejects that approach. This report says, suppose that the state is not trying to govern. What if the benevolence we attribute to the state doesn't exist? So that we move away from thinking that this is a state that is trying to govern and has been misled in the process of governing, and therefore your reform approach is to give it a cure, and therefore the state will be fine. And the reason why the state capture perspective is superior to any other approach, at least for these purposes of this discussion, is that if you see the state as a well-organized elite cartel that basically runs two states. It runs a shadow state and runs a constitutional state. But the reason why the constitutional state exists is to service the shadow state. The state isn't a government at all. The state is not run by a government at all. It is run by a vertically integrated criminal organization. That is a way to understand the state, operating in the shadow of the constitutional state. So that you've got this vertically integrated criminal network, a mafia in effect, that is then operating behind the shadow of a constitutional state. So that is the institutional side of capture. But capture also has a bureaucratic side. In its bureaucratic side, capture has a group of favored officials who are allowed to accumulate power, concentrate it, and exercise it in completely unaccountable ways, often behind the shield of presidential privilege.